In the murkier corners of the internet, where encrypted chat rooms and obscure forums intersect with extremist propaganda, a name surfaces again and again. The Order of Nine Angles, or O9A. To casual observers, it might appear as little more than a fringe satanic group, but to counter-terrorism experts, journalists, and grieving families of radicalized youth, the O9A represents something far darker, a philosophy of esoteric violence that has inspired extremists across continents. What sets O9A apart from other occult movements is not just its fascination with satanic ritual, but its fusion of mysticism, fascism, and terrorism. Its writings call not merely for self-discovery through ritual, but for culling, the euphemism for murder as a form of initiation. Its members have been linked to neo-Nazi plots, lone wolf extremists, and more recently to Group 764, a shadowy online network accused of grooming teenagers into acts of violence in the name of the order. We actually covered it in my last video here. Now, the story of 09A is one of transformation, from a strange self-published set of occult pamphlets in the 1970s England to a transnational digital cult influencing some of the most volatile extremist subcultures of the 21st century. It is a tale of how ideas, once confined to obscure zines and secret gatherings in rural Britain, became weaponized in the internet age. And we are covering it all. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I post one deep dive on a cult every single Saturday, and starting in October, I'll be starting a new series called True Crime Tuesday, where I cover a true crime case. So buckle up, get ready for that, and leave your case suggestions down in the comments below. Now, last week's video covered Group 746, this really unsettling online group full of teenagers who are being encouraged into things like self-mutilation. Order of the Nine Angles actually was a group that inspired Group 764, the topic of my previous video. So I wanted to do its own video because there is a lot to cover about this group because it started all the way back in the 1960s. So buckle up and let's discover how this obscure 60s cult influenced children of the future. So back in the 60s and 70s, it was a cultural moment when the occult revival was sweeping Britain. Aleister Crowley's Thelema, Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, and Wicca were all attracting followers who were eager to rebel against Christian morality and mainstream society. But amid this eclectic mix of alternative spiritualities, one man began to articulate something uniquely sinister. That man was David Mamet, though for years he preferred to remain in the shadows using pseudonyms like Anton Long. But he was born in 1950 and was already deeply enmeshed in Britain's far-right scene by the 1970s. He was rubbing shoulders with neo-Nazis and radical extremists. Awesome. But unlike many who pursued fascism through politics, Mamet sought to fuse political extremism with mystical initiation. The result was what he would later call the Order of Nine Angles. O9A's origins are deliberately shrouded in myth. In its earliest texts, Anton Long claimed the group descended from a secretive pre-Christian tradition in the British Isles, supposedly preserved by rural witches and pagan mystics. The story told of a hidden order passed down through covens in the English countryside, with knowledge of esoteric rituals and dark gods unknown to mainstream occultists. But investigative scholars and journalists have since demonstrated that this was all a fabrication. There's no credible evidence that exists of such a lineage. Instead, O9A appears to have been largely the invention of Myatt himself, who stitched together fragments of pagan folklore, occult writings, and of course his own political ideology into a new system. The nine Ingalls themselves were not inherited from an ancient pagan tradition, but lifted from earlier occult references, particularly Hermetic and neo-pagan symbolism. And I find it increasingly fascinating that this was supposed to be a rebellion against Christianity and the Catholic Church, when the Catholic Church is notorious for actually stealing a bunch of pagan traditions and then putting a new label on them and then branding paganism as like work with the devil. So it's interesting that in this rebellion from Christianity or Catholicism, David over here is just doing the same thing that Catholics did. It takes one to know one, I guess. So by crafting this mythic backstory, O9A could present itself as a more authentic, more dangerous, and more secretive than rival satanic movements. Now, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, O9A began publishing pamphlets and grimoires that circulated through the British occult underground. Among the most influential were the Black Book of Satan, which was a manual of rituals that invoked dark deities and emphasized the necessity of secrecy. There was also Neos, a practical guide to modern magic, which was a handbook outlining O9A's system of initiation and self-transformation. There was the Hostia, a compilation of essays framing O9A as a sinister alternative to mainstream Satanism, which is so funny they were calling Satanism mainstream at all. But what distinguished O9A's texts from the playful rebellion of LaVeyan Satanism was their explicit embrace of transgression and violence. Where LaVey spoke of Satan as a symbol of individualism, O9A texts presented Satan as a literal cosmic force aligned with destruction. To progress spiritually, the initiate had to embrace real-world acts of danger, law-breaking, and in some cases, murder. From its beginnings, O9A functioned not as a mass movement, but as a cultic network of small, secretive nexions, or cells that could operate independently yet share a common ideology. These nexions would gather for rituals, study the texts, and initiate members through insight roles, tasks that were designed to test loyalty and commitment. The insight role system would later become infamous. Members were encouraged to infiltrate hostile or dangerous groups, police forces, military units, rival religions, as a way of both strengthening themselves and trying to weaken society from within. Unlike many occult groups that remained insular, O9A explicitly encouraged subversion of mainstream institutions. During the 1980s, O9A remained a small underground presence. Its ties to Britain's far-right scene, however, did not go unnoticed. Security services began to take interest in the blending of occult ideology and neo-Nazi politics, though at the time it was still regarded as fringe. Myatt himself oscillated between direct political activism, joining neo-Nazi organizations such as the National Socialist Movement, and his more esoteric role as Anton Long. By the close of the 80s, O9A had established the building blocks of its cult identity. We have a mythic lineage that was fabricated but compelling to recruits, a set of grimoires outlining the ritual practice and ideology. We have that cell-based structure of nexions, and we have a doctrine that violence and transgression were central to spiritual advancement. So this was not just Satanism. It was an experiment in ideological fusion, occult mysticism serving as a gateway into political extremism, and extremism framed as mystical. Now, if the Order of Nine Angles began as a strange fusion of occult mysticism and far right extremism, its belief system soon evolved into a doctrine unlike any other. Where many occult groups relied on symbols, theater, and myth, O9A sought to collapse the boundary between ritual and reality. In its worldview, the initiate's spiritual growth depended on embracing those transgressions, and not just metaphorically, but literally. By the late 80s and early 90s, O9A texts had codified a system of beliefs and practices that blended Satanism, paganism, and esoteric fascism into a coherent framework. These practices became the hallmark of O9A's cult identity, distinguishing it from other occult sects and foreshadowing its later influence on extremist movements worldwide. Central to O9A philosophy is what its text called the sinister way. Unlike mainstream Satanism, which often positions itself as atheist rebellion, the sinister way insists that dark forces described as acausal entities or dark gods are real. To align oneself with them, initiates must pursue personal transformation through ordeals of hardship, risk, and moral inversion. The sinister way is presented as a path of sevenfold initiation. It's a progressive system in which each stage requires the initiate to confront deeper challenges and embrace ever greater transgressions. Unlike structured religions with congregations, O9A's framework encourages individual testing and secrecy, giving its Nexions the flexibility to adapt and survive without central leadership is paramount. One of the strangest features of O9A cosmology is its belief in the acausal, a metaphysical realm outside ordinary time and space inhabited by entities known as the dark gods. Unlike Christian demons or pagan deities, these dark gods are described as primal forces of chaos, destruction, and entropy. In O9A myth, human civilization is destined to collapse, making way for a new aeon in which these entities will return to dominance. The initiate's role is to hasten that collapse, serving as a catalyst for chaos. Rituals invoking the dark gods were not intended merely for psychological effect. O9A texts suggested that through these practices, people could literally connect with those acausal energies, gaining strength to disrupt the causal world. This cosmology provided both a spiritual justification and a practical mandate to destroy the present order of society as a sacred duty. Perhaps the most notorious aspect of O9A practice is the concept of insight roles. Initiates were instructed to spend between 6 months and 2 years immersing themselves in a hostile or alien environment, deliberately adopting roles that tested their loyalty and their commitment. Examples of insight roles would include joining a rival religion, or enlisting in law enforcement or the military to learn discipline and new skills, entering criminal organizations or extremist political groups, all because the goal was twofold. One, to transform the individual through hardship, and two, weaken mainstream institutions from within. By inhabiting the worldview of others, initiates were supposed to transcend ordinary morality and strengthen their capacity for manipulation, violence, and secrecy. Critics would later identify insight roles as a blueprint for infiltration, particularly in the way O9A encouraged members to embed themselves within the armed forces or extremist political movements. Now, this element of practice blurred the line between esoteric ritual and real-world subversion. But no belief or practice illustrates O9A's extremism more starkly than its doctrine of culling. In O9A literature, culling is described as the ritual killing of a human being, presented as a sacred duty that tests the initiate's courage and loyalty. Far from metaphorical, O9A texts detail how culling should be approached, targeting individuals deemed weak, parasitic, or socially undesirable. Some writings even suggest specific methods of murder, couched in the language of initiation. So, to outsiders, this doctrine represents the clearest evidence that O9A functions as a cult of violence. Unlike most occult groups, which restrict transgression to symbolic ritual, O9A elevated murder into a spiritual sacrament. Though not all members are believed to have carried out culling, the idea itself did normalize violence as a path to enlightenment, creating this dangerous overlap between esotericism and terrorism. Law enforcement agencies would later link O9A inspired individuals to actual killings and terror plots, often citing culling as a motivating factor. Imagine thinking that you need to kill somebody to become spiritually enlightened. It's absolutely horrifying. And to think that that ideology could have influenced a group run by teenagers like Group 764, it's utterly mortifying because it's this idea that you have to suffer in order to succeed. And I feel like that's kind of honestly, and this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, I think that ideology has actually kind of subconsciously embedded itself into anyone who lives in a capitalistic society because there is this idea of we need to suffer in order to be successful. We have to work really, really, really hard in order to get money, success, fame if people want it. As someone who considers themselves an artist who is active in an artistic community, I can tell you that the trope starving artist is true, where I see so many people clinging to this idea that life should be really, really hard for them if they want to succeed. So they won't get a full-time job. They will, if they do, they'll work paycheck to paycheck. There's this lack of feeling of abundance and this lack of prioritizing your financial health in the artistic space because of this trope of being a starving artist in order to succeed, as if suffering will make you a better performer or artist. It's kind of scary how all of this seems to be kind of subconsciously linked into the way a lot of us live our lives, and it's kind of ironic considering that O9A is very, very anti-society, but they're also kind of like infusing their ideology into it. I don't know. I feel like Homeboy David was really confused. Now let's talk about the ceremonies, because O9A ceremonies themselves are a blend of theatrical Satanism and pagan symbolism. Rituals might involve chanting in esoteric languages, invocations of dark gods, or even the performance of sacrificial rites, like murdering animals or humans, depending on the initiate's stage. Because remember, they have those 7 tiers in order to reach true enlightenment. However, the true distinctiveness of O9A rituals isn't that they have the aesthetic and they're chanting in a dark room and doing an animal sacrifice. It's more so in the psychological function of the ideology. Initiates were encouraged to deliberately commit crimes or commit acts that would violate their own ethical boundaries, whether through illegal activities, blasphemy, or actual violence. In this sense, ritual served as a tool of deconditioning, of breaking down conventional morality and reshaping the self according to the sinister way. Within this group's nexions, they exhibit many of the traits common to cults. There's this secrecy and isolation. Members are encouraged to keep their affiliation with the group hidden and to operate in very small, tight-knit cells. Advancement within the group also requires mastering a body of secret writings that are often only distributed to initiates. And this gives this feeling of exclusivity, kind of like that Scientology bridge where once you pay more money to take more courses and do more audits, then and only then are you allowed to know the truth about the foundations and the creation of the cult. And that's when you learn that there's like a giant lizard in the sky. Yeah. O9A also promotes radical commitment. Through insight roles and culling, members prove their loyalty to the group by committing acts of irreversible transgression. I think it's all just so homeboy David can get off on knowing that he's convincing people to harm other people. But what's interesting about the structure of O9A is because unlike charismatic cults that are built around a single figure, O9A's structure is more networked and viral, enabling it to spread without having one centralized organization. This design would later prove crucial to its survival in the digital age. So in the 1980s and 90s, O9A also distinguished itself through open hostility towards mainstream satanic groups. Anton LaVey's Church of Satan and Michael Aquino's Temple of Set were dismissed by O9A as safe and cosmetic forms of Satanism, offering rebellion without real danger. O9A's rhetoric accused these groups of catering to Western individualism, while the order claimed to embody a sinister, amoral path that demanded real risk. And that means we're better than you, other Satanists. This positioning allowed O9A to attract a niche following of extremists who were disillusioned with what they saw as the domesticated rebellion of other Satanist groups. So by the 90s, O9A's teachings had spread across Britain and were carried through zines, photocopied pamphlets, and word-of-mouth networks among occultists and far-right extremists. Nexions began to appear in continental Europe and North America, often operating semi-independently while sharing a core set of texts. The decentralized model of this group meant that anyone could declare themselves part of it, provided they adhered to the teachings and killed people. This franchise-like structure made the order really difficult to track, yet it also ensured continuity even when individual Nexions were dissolved. And this is exactly what we see with Group 764 from my previous video. It seemed like even though they caught the guy that started it, there were so many offshoots of it and so many different Discord groups that the FBI still has not been able to just totally squash it completely. So it was during this period that O9A's doctrines of culling, infiltration, and dark god worship began to seep into the consciousness of adjacent subcultures, laying the groundwork for its future ties to neo-Nazi and jihadist movements. By the end of the 90s, O9A had established a unique ideological ecosystem, a mythology of dark gods and cosmic chaos, a ritual system of transgression culminating in culling, a practice of infiltration encouraging initiates to subvert mainstream institutions, and a cellular structure that allowed global replication without central control. The order was not just a fringe occult curiosity. It was becoming a philosophy of radical disruption, capable of merging with political extremists and inspiring violence. As the new millennium dawned, O9A would move from the underground zine culture of the 20th century and into the digital networks of the 21st, a transition that would multiply its reach, magnify its dangers, and connect it to some of the most volatile extremist currents of the internet age. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Order of Nine Angles had already distinguished itself from other occult sects through its doctrines. But it was in the early 2000s and 2010s that O9A transitioned from an obscure occult group to a transnational extremist network, influencing neo-Nazi cults, online hate communities, and even jihadist sympathizers. This period marks a critical chapter in O9A's history. Its migration from zines and underground covens into the digital sphere, where its texts, memes, and rituals could circulate globally. The internet amplified O9A's reach, allowing it to connect with and radicalize individuals who might never have encountered it in physical occult circles. O9A's ideological overlap with far-right extremism has been present since its inception, given David Myatt's long-standing ties to British neo-Nazism. But in the 2000s, those overlaps became operational. Far-right extremists disillusioned with traditional political movements increasingly turned toward subcultures. O9A's emphasis on elitism, violence, and infiltration resonated strongly with these groups. Its literature circulated among networks such as Combat 18 or C18, a violent neo-Nazi organization in the UK who is notorious for promoting leaderless resistance, the National Socialist Movement or NSM, a US-based neo-Nazi group that adopted O9A material into its online forums, and the Atomwaffen Division, AWD, which is perhaps the most infamous link. AWD in the US drew directly from O9A texts, adopting its aesthetic and doctrines of accelerationism. The connection to Atomwaffen Division was especially significant. It was founded in 2015, and it glorified violence, murder, and terrorism as tools to accelerate the collapse of modern society, a philosophy that was nearly identical to O9A's apocalyptic vision of ushering in a new aeon. Investigators would later uncover O9A texts among AWD members' materials, and several members openly discussed O9A ideas in private chats. This ideological fusion, Satan occultism with accelerationist neo-Nazism, gave rise to what some analysts now call occult fascism. There are just so many isms. O9A's writings contributed directly to the rise of accelerationist terrorism, which is the belief that violent acts should be committed to destabilize society and hasten its collapse. Key texts like Hostia and the Black Book of Satan framed destruction as sacred. And meanwhile, Myatt's broader philosophy emphasized the honor of the warrior and the necessity of revolutionary violence. These ideas blended seamlessly with the accelerationist currents running through far-right extremist movements in the 2000s. For many disaffected extremists, O9A provided a mythic and spiritual justification for violence, elevating terrorism from a political act to a sacred duty. This sacralization of violence made O9A uniquely dangerous. It offered not just propaganda, but a religious framework for mass murder. One of the most bizarre chapters in O9A's history came in the late 90s and early 2000s when David Myatt, its founder, publicly converted to Islam. Taking the name Abdul Aziz ibn Myatt, he became an outspoken supporter of jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and even praised Osama bin Laden. Myatt's flirtation with jihadism has been the subject of much speculation. Some scholars argue that it was a genuine conversion, while others believe it was an insight role on a grand scale, consistent with O9A's doctrine of infiltration. And you know what is crazy about this is it's such a manipulative tactic by a cult leader, because if you ever change your mind, you ever change your ideology, you can just say you're doing it under the guise of doing an insight and doing an infiltration. So even if you do decide to totally 180 your belief system as the leader, you can say, oh, well, I'm just getting the inside scoop. I'm not really like this. It literally allows the leader to flip-flop whenever they want. And regardless of his motives, Myatt's embrace of jihadist ideology did mirror O9A's broader strategy, which was to destabilize Western society by aligning with any force of violent opposition, whether fascist or Islamist. This ideological fluidity is one of the order's most distinctive traits. It doesn't tie itself to a single political doctrine, but instead embraces any worldview that accelerates societal collapse. And as a result, O9A literature has circulated in both far-right and jihadist spaces, creating these strange crossovers that baffle conventional counterterrorism frameworks. The 2000s also marked O9A's full transition into the digital underground. Its texts, once photocopied and traded hand-to-hand, were now scanned, uploaded, and distributed through early forums devoted to Satanism, occults, and neo-Nazi ideology. File-sharing sites and torrent networks where PDFs of grimoires could be downloaded globally, and image boards and encrypted chat rooms, which happened particularly in the 2010s, where memes and slogans distilled O9A doctrine into viral content. So this digital migration ensured O9A's survival. Even as Nexion started to dissolve in physical spaces, their teachings became immortalized online. By the mid-2010s, anyone with an internet connection could access O9A's core writings, leading to a surge in self-identified adherents around the world. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, O9A-linked individuals began surfacing in cases across Europe and North America. A few examples that highlight the group's growing notoriety are the UK soldiers and police infiltration, because reports surfaced that individuals in the British Army and police forces had ties to O9A, echoing the order's doctrine of insight roles. And these cases obviously raised alarm about the group's potential to infiltrate security institutions. Between 2017 and 2019, there were also several murders committed by Atomwaffen members that were later found to be associated with O9A-inspired ideology. The FBI identified O9A as a contributing influence in its assessment of AWD. So these incidents just reinforce the perception of O9A as not merely an esoteric sect, but a real-world threat capable of inspiring terrorism. By mid-2010s, law enforcement agencies in the UK, US, and Europe were taking serious notice of O9A. Reports from the MI5, Europol, and the FBI described the group as a significant threat, particularly given its infiltration of far-right extremist networks. Academic studies also began to frame O9A as a part of a broader phenomenon of Satanic neo-Nazism or esoteric fascism. Scholars noted the group's unique ability to merge spiritual mysticism with violent extremism, creating a subculture that appealed to alienated youth and disaffected radicals alike. Despite growing awareness, O9A's decentralized structure made it exceptionally difficult to counter. With no official membership roles, no centralized leadership, and no headquarters, it couldn't be dismantled like a traditional organization. Part of O9A's resilience lay in that ambiguity. Myatt himself periodically disavowed connections to the order, even as evidence suggested that his pseudonym, Antong Long, authored its foundational texts. O9A writings often blurred the line between myth and reality, making it difficult for outsiders to determine how many adherents actually followed its more extreme doctrines, like culling. This ambiguity functioned as a shield. Adherents could claim that O9A was merely a philosophical exercise, not a real call to violence. Yet at the same time, its texts continued to radicalize individuals into violent extremism. So by the end of the 2010s, O9A had fully established itself as a digital-aged cult influencing neo-Nazi terrorism, infiltrating institutions, and proliferating online. But its most dangerous mutation was yet to come: the rise of Group 764, a network that would weaponize O9A teachings for the internet generation, grooming teenagers into acts of violence under its sinister banner. And if you want a deep dive into Group 764, I mentioned earlier in this video, I just covered it last week, but I'll drop the link here again. It'll also be in the description of the video. So by 2020, O9A had been identified as a security threat by multiple governments. The UK's Home Office considered banning the group outright following pressure from anti-terror watchdogs. Law enforcement in Germany, Canada, and the US began issuing intelligence briefings connecting O9A to far-right terrorism. But despite this scrutiny, O9A proved remarkably resilient. Its decentralized leadership design allowing Nexions to reappear even when specific groups were disrupted. Online, its grimoires and initiation materials circulated freely, immune to censorship because they were endlessly mirrored and re-uploaded across platforms. And at the same time, social media and encrypted messaging platforms accelerated O9A's recruitment tactics. Unlike in the past, when initiates had to seek out texts in niche occult bookstores or underground signs, now a teenager could stumble across O9A material through a meme on Telegram, or Discord, or even Twitter. This environment created fertile ground for Group 764 to emerge. So the question that concerned parents who are afraid that their teenager is going to find Group 764 online, all the way to the FBI and investigative journalists and scholars who have been studying O9A for decades, we all wonder, what's going on with this group now? Well, O9A and its digital offshoots remain active and adaptive. While specific Nexions rise and fall, the ideology continues to circulate freely online. Group 764 has been disrupted in some jurisdictions, but its networked nature ensures that fragments persist, sometimes under new names or encrypted servers. Government agencies have debated whether to designate O9A formally as a the UK considered such in 2021, but faced legal hurdles due to O9A's lack of formal hierarchy or leadership. This structural ambiguity remains both its greatest strength and a barrier to legal suppression. And meanwhile, O9A inspired cases continue to emerge, from arrests of teenagers with terroristic intent to the discovery of occult fascist literature in the homes of violent extremists. Each case kind of supports the enduring danger that O9A may not have the size of a mass movement, but its ideas are spreading like a virus, infecting individuals across borders and even generations. So, what can we do as a society to push back, fight back? In my opinion, the answer to a question like that is, and always has been, sharing information. We have to talk more about these dangerous groups. We are seeing such an influx in far-right ideology that could be inspired by a dangerous, potentially terroristic group like this, promoting ideas in the mainstream. When we have representatives saying things like, yeah, we should just kill the homeless, or implying that murder is okay if you don't think that person is contributing to society, these are dangerous, dangerous ways to think. And this type of ideology should hold no place in society, and specifically in our political systems. It's really, really scary that these types of ideas are allowed to spread freely through the internet just because these platforms want users and want to gain people's attention. We're kind of living in this era where people are not considering the impact that the words and the things that they share online and the ideas they post, it can lead to some catastrophic events. And I think we've seen that this week on honestly every side of the political spectrum. And I think it really is our responsibility, whether you have an influence or a platform. It is certainly more important for you to be aware if you do have a large platform. You are spreading certain rhetoric willy-nilly without considering the impact you might have on people on a day-to-day basis. The parasocial relationship that we have with the people we see online is dangerous because it allows certain humans to excuse their behaviors. It's almost like letting the intrusive thoughts win over and over again because you have someone who you're a fan of saying that those things are okay. So please be careful of what you say online. Be cautious of what you hear anybody say online, even if they say it clearly and they articulate well and they speak with authority. Everybody can make stuff up. Every time you hear an alarming fact or ideology being spread online, you should literally ask the opposite question to yourself. That will spark your critical thinking, and it could protect you from getting indoctrinated and going down a really dangerous rabbit hole. So anyways, you guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really hope you all stay safe out there. Please comment down below what your thoughts are about this group and I suppose other groups you're seeing online. And please just protect yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all of the above. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. I'll see you soon. Bye.